Greetings. My name is Josh Greubel. I'm the band director here at Central DeWitt in DeWitt, Iowa. I have been teaching for 23 years. My past 16 years have been here at Central DeWitt High School. And today I'm going to share with you some of the things that I've learned along the way in my session titled The Positive Impact of the Choir Entry at the Solo and Ensemble Festival. Thank you for taking time to watch this video, whether it's at IBA in the room or on your own on the app. I wanted to start with just a little bit of the philosophy that we have here at Central DeWitt in the high school for solo and ensemble. It's been our philosophy and goal to have 100% participation in solo and ensemble preparation and performance. Every student in our program is placed in an appropriate instrumental choir. Kids that wish to be considered for honor band nominations, first chairs, students that just wish to get better, also several kids that we just are always trying to encourage to just keep working. Also take solos to contest as well. Our percussion students, freshmen, sophomore, and juniors are required to take at least one and potentially two solos, depending upon time and what instrument that they are required to that year. Each year, we try to form between 5 and 10 ensembles out of our top players as well. What we do here at Central DeWitt, we are Class 3A school for IHS-MA, and the way our calendar typically works is that we have an end of February concert. Right after that end of February concert, there's about 3 weeks of school, and then there's also a week of spring break typically, but we have about 3 weeks of school time to prepare, and that we take time to work on instrumental choirs. We focus on the micro to help the macro, and it works really well for us. Class time is dedicated to those choir practices, and I'll talk a little bit more about how that schedule has worked and developed as we move on. This philosophy isn't something that I started. Even you young directors and veteran directors know, you take good ideas and you make them your own. When I student taught in Oelwein, Iowa, with Mr. Doug McFarland. Doug had nearly 200 kids in his 3A program at the time, and all of the kids were involved in some kind of choir. Doug had several of his own philosophies, and definitely some mottos and sayings. Band is good for all students, even when some of those students aren't necessarily always good for band. And also take the students from where they are and just make them better. I've kind of over the years added that caveat: make them better people. Our goal isn't always to make our students to be the next oboe player in some professional symphony. It's for them to work as a group and learn life skills, and through music and our ensembles to find that path. Choir entries. I want to talk about some ideas of how that entry works. Choir entries for the Music Association rules are typically between 7 and 24 players. With the regulations that are placed in our handbook, the IHS-MA handbook, are choirs, there are a couple of things that are very specific. Choir entries may have multiple players on each part. This is an important nuance and distinction between ensembles and choirs. On ensembles, everybody needs to be playing those individual parts. If you've got a quartet, you got 4 players, everybody's on a part. And whereas a choir, you could take that same quartet, double each part, 8 players, now it's a choir entry. Everybody has a little more support with each other. And the other caveat that you can do, you can conduct it. This is an important factor for some of us. I'm a bit of a control freak in front of my ensemble, and I like to have that power to be able to help them. Ensembles are a fantastic avenue for kids to be working on, to develop and to work as a group. And sometimes it's just hard to let go of those reins for that performance when it's just on the cusp. You might have if you have some kind of quartet and you got 3 outstanding players and one kid that might be just a little behind the other ones. And if that person might fumble just a little bit, that whole performance can just implode. A choir entry, of course, those things can still happen in there, but by being a conductor, you can still cue and you can help some of those things along throughout the performance. Regulation, a couple of regulation factors. Performance time is a minimum of 2.5 minutes and a maximum of 6. Very similar to the solos as well as the ensembles. The other thing I wanted to point out about from the IHSMA is that the ballot is I've got a link on the handout for you, but that ballot looks very much like the concert band large group ballot, and that also will tie into some of the benefits as your students go from solo and ensemble to large group. Finding those nuances of what the judges were looking for, what they're listening to, and what they hear happening within your section, and then how that can translate to fixing those things as you progress and work towards large group. There are a set of books that I'd highly recommend looking at as we talk about some of these entries and some of these possibilities. And I have a nice list for you as well. But the basic books, and all of these books are Rubank, now Hal Leonard publications. But the quartet repertoire books, there are sets for flute, sets for clarinet, sets for saxophone. The flute books, I believe, are pink. The saxophone ones are an orange hue. There's even ensemble repertoire for woodwind quintet. If you were to double those parts, I believe that set of books is blue. The clarinet choir repertoire books, those are green. So those are all Rubank collections that have a ton of possible selections that can work and are really great. Brass sextets. There are 2 different sets of Rubank books that I highly recommend. The concert repertoire for brass sextet, as well as the brass recital for brass sextet. And then there are 2 last examples, or 2 last sets of collections that are even more basic, that you can you're basically working with quartets and just filling out things. 10 masterworks for woodwind choir and 10 masterworks for brass choir that are both published by Shawnee. That list is there. You can check those out via J.W. Pepper to get some glimpses, and then of course order through your local West Music or Reman's, whoever calls upon you. Choirs. As I was saying, these quartet repertoire books are a great starting point because the place where you can start is with quartets. Take a quartet and double it. You have 8 kids now and 2 on each part. There's a lot of ways you can think about how to fill those spots. Take that best player, put them on first, second best on second, third best on third, fourth best on fourth, and then fill in some of the younger players on all those parts so that they're gonna grow by hearing a strong player on each of those parts. Sometimes, and I'll share with you some examples in a little bit, but you put your top 2 players on that first part, and that's all the first part that's all the part you're gonna hear. So it's about balance and things as well. It can start with a quartet. You can expand it to 3 on each part. You can expand from quartets to quintets that are doubled, sextets that are doubled. Then, after you get through that, once you hit 7 parts, which there is lots of different music available for all types of instrumental choirs. Once you hit that seven part area, then you're starting to look like 1 on a part or 2 on a part. You do have a limit of how many students that can typically be in your choirs. And almost all of the choirs are minimum of 7 kids, maximum of 24. That has to do with performance venues as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit as well. Flute choirs. Flute choirs, there's some great places to start with quartets. There are some in doubling those things, but there's a ton of great literature that usually starts with that land at about 6 parts, and those 6 parts then of course can be doubled, or you put your stronger players by themselves and double some of the where the younger players are playing. The addition of an alto flute and bass flute and piccolo are really nice timbre additions to this entry, as well as to start to stretch some of your students. When a lot of us get to that point where that piccolo player is graduating and we haven't done any training, giving a younger player a piccolo part on a flute choir or woodwind choir, and getting them started just a little bit earlier with having to just work on one piece, that can help quite a bit. And I have a couple of examples that we're going to share with you. This is an example of Ripples in the Sand. This has 6 flute parts as well as auxiliary percussion. And so we've got 1 on each part. And here's one more short excerpt. This is an example from Air from the Suite in D by Bach. This has 4 flute parts, 4 C flute parts, 1 alto flute part, and string bass. So those are just a couple of examples of works that work really well for flute choir. Now, before we go any farther, I need to talk about another entry, and that is called the mixed instrumental choir. The mixed instrument choir is 7 to 12 players of woodwind, brass, string, percussion instruments of any combination, maybe directed, maybe not accompanied. This is for captions of choirs that don't fit any other caption. And as you enter this for IHSMA, you get to choose whether it's a woodwind brass adjudicator, a percussion adjudicator, or one of, so you can be a little more specific. Both of these flute choir examples that I've shown you, when I enter them, these particular pieces, I would have to enter them as a mixed instrument choir because of the addition of a string bass or the addition of percussion parts. They are flute choirs, and so I would typically want to try to get the flute judge to listen to them. So that has to do with communicating that to our executive director as well. One other thing, the horn can only be in a mixed woodwind ensemble. So using a French horn could end up being in like this mixed instrument choir. You could not put a horn in a woodwind choir. It could be in a mixed woodwind ensemble, but not a mixed woodwind in a woodwind choir. The next thing I want to talk briefly about is clarinet choirs. Clarinet choirs, once again, you can start with a quartet. That can be all B flat instruments, and you can double that. If you take that fourth part, a lot of times those fourth parts are bass clarinet parts. So 2 bass clarinets and 6 regular clarinets. If you go into your older repertoire, the third part, that tenor part, is typically alto clarinet. So I know that's kind of the old stepchild, but most of us probably still have some of these sitting on a shelf. They're definitely a peculiar instrument, but some kids really enjoy that uniqueness, and it is a timbre change. Clarinet choirs are a wonderful way to expand some of the opportunities for your kids, to add that E flat soprano clarinet, to add contra E flat or contra B flat instruments. And I have just a couple examples of those that I can just share with you. Here's an example called Allegro by Bach. We have first, second, third, fourth clarinet parts, as well as bass clarinet. All the parts are doubled or tripled. Here's one more, a slight modification. Here's that same example. On this part, fourth part now has alto clarinet with it, 2 alto clarinets and a fourth clarinet. And bass clarinet has been expanded to a bass and a contra. So you get an extra octave in there. So that addition of a contrabass clarinet, the bass clarinet, that contrabass can read a bass clarinet part and it'll give that nice extra octave change. Contra alto part, if you have contra alto parts, those play just a little bit differently. They're an octave below an alto clarinet. So if you can definitely do a little bit more research on that to kind of see how much depth you can get and how many different parts, and so how many different colors and timbres that you want to create. I have one more example of clarinet for you. Here's a different example. This is Eine kleine Knock music. This piece has first, second, third clarinet parts, alto clarinet, bass clarinet, and contrapart. It also has E flat as an optional part. So we've got first through third, as well as alto. We've got a bass and contra and an E first. So you can hear all of the thickness of the score. So that's just a little bit of examples of that. When you work towards a saxophone choir, once again, you have a minimum of four parts doubled. You can expand that. There is that quartet repertoire for saxophone book that I talked about, that you can start to double, or maybe the first alto sax is strong enough, and then you have double second alto and tenor and bari as well. There are a ton of old saxophone ensemble entries, or collections that within the score have some optional parts. You can see up to 6 parts, but that same work will work as a quartet, work as a quintet, or work as a sextet. As a quartet, 2 altos, tenor, bari. As a quintet, 2 alto, 2 tenor, and a bari. And then as a sextet, 3 alto, 2 tenor, and 1 bari. Collection, some of those pieces that I have found some great success for with my kids. There's a piece, first movement by Dvorak, third movement, Military March by Haydn, Pizza Party, a particular favorite of my students, and El Capeo. I think a lot of directors recognize that as a quartet, quintet, or sextet piece. But imagine that piece doubling it or even tripling it. I think the largest saxophone group I've had is a triple sextet, so 18 saxophones. That Dvorak was very dark. That Haydn, when I did it, was a little more bright. And El Capeo was just a blast. So those are some ideas about saxophone choirs. Obviously, then you can start adding soprano sax. Many of you are fortunate to have one. When you start doubling those things, you might not need to double that soprano sax. That brings us to woodwind choirs. Woodwind choirs, I think, are one of the most important groups to be able to use. When I'm assigning all my kids out to ensembles, all my flutes are in the flute choir, all my clarinets are in clarinet choir, all saxophones in that. And my woodwind choir then is a select group. And so I'm able to push them and challenge them with some harder repertoire. Maximum of 24 kids. And so when you look at the instrumentation, typically 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 bassoons, 3 clarinets, bass clarinet, 2 altos, tenor, and bari, your numbers are pretty strong. So I'm typically taking one on a part and expanding, usually expanding the clarinets to 2 to 3 on a part, whatever the balance is that I need to get there. With that maximum of 24, sometimes there'll be an alto clarinet or contra parts as well, or even a piccolo part. Woodwind choirs, addition of piccolo, E flat, soprano, alto, contra, those can give some nice timbre changes as well. And I'll talk about some potential pieces that I've used, and I've got a list for people. But there are a lot of really good woodwind choir things probably sitting in your libraries, and there's such a big variety as well. I've had saxophone. I know I have like a clarinet choir piece that has a solo saxophone plus clarinet. By mixing the instruments, a woodwind choir would be the most appropriate ensemble for that entry. The next entry, just talk briefly about French horn choir. Minimum of 7, maximum of 24. Many of us are lucky if we have a small number of those kids. French horn is sometimes hard to find those enough kids to be doing those things. But French horn choir, maybe this is the time to start converting some of those trumpets or some of those trombones to French horn, so that you're starting to develop some of those habits and get some of those people to start making those switches. Minimum of 4 parts, doubled, but there's some really good quintet and sextet things, available as well. One thing that I would like to make sure that you're thinking about, because of French horns, the range and things, you'll find that a lot of times that lowest part is potentially going to have to learn to read bass clef, and so that it shouldn't be a nuisance, but it is one thing you'll have to consider. Trumpet choirs, there's so much repertoire out there, that you can definitely start with quartets, and build from quintets to sextets, and then once you hit that seven mark, there's all kinds of different things. But the addition of flugelhorns, piccolo trumpet, I don't know if tons of us have those in our inventory, but many of us definitely have some flugelhorns, or even stretching it to bass trumpets. Now, most of us really don't probably have a whole lot of those in our library, in our instrumentation, in our programs, but bass trumpets are basically just your marching trombones. So if you find the right music that's called for it, you can definitely find something that will work with that. Some of these works can be trumpet choirs, all the way from Palestrina and some of the Robert King music, all to Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child, which is like a jazz piece with solo trumpet, and the rest of the trumpets are an accompaniment. There's sometimes it's a battle of 2 different choirs, 4 kids on one side of the stage, 4 kids on the other side, and some antiphonal stuff. Trombone choirs are very similar to trumpet choirs, but in this case, we got the addition of bass trombone. Similar to French horn, where you had the lower parts having to learn bass clef. Here, bass trombones are going below the staff, and your lead trombone parts are sometimes having to learn tenor clef. So those aren't things that can hold you back. They're just things to think about. Trombone choir, there's a lot of really good repertoire when it comes to like the Robert King publishings. That brings us to brass choirs, and I have a couple of short examples I'll show you here. 7 to 24 players, minimum of 4 parts, doubled. A quintet would a quintet, a brass quintet for those of you that might not know, is typically 2 trumpets, a horn, a baritone or a trombone, typically trombone, and a tuba. A sextet would be 2 trumpets, horn, trombone, euphonium, and tuba. And a couple of examples that you're going to see are from the collection concert repertoire for brass sextet. This example is an example of Pizza Party. This is a brass sextet that's just been doubled. So that was just a quick example of a sextet that's just been doubled, and that takes care of all the parts. Now, because I have and maybe I wouldn't double all those players, but maybe just needed to double a couple, and that takes care of my whole brass section. Similar, some of you with smaller schools, maybe the woodwind choir is the only entry that'll work for you, but that takes care of all your woodwind section. Fabulous. But consider that what that can do for your group. In this collection of books, the parts can expand to 4 trumpets, 3 horn, 3 bone, euphonium, and tuba. So here's that example. This is that same piece, Pizza Party. And from this book, now we have 4 trumpet parts, 3 French horn parts, 3 trombone parts, baritone, and tuba, 1 on a part. So you have a lot of flexibility there as well, just with that collection of books of what you can do. A low brass choir, a minimum of 4 parts. This is any combination of trombones, euphoniums, and tubas. A typical low brass choir traditionally would be probably 3 bone parts, two euphonium parts, and a tuba. For me, as a euphonium player, one of the ensembles that I got to play in college and built up a large repertoire of was tuba quartets. And so a lot of times I kind of look at my collection of that and see if there's something that works there. And those tuba quartets would be 2 euphonium parts and 2 tuba parts. Now that top tuba part really lies in a lower trombone or a lower euphonium part, because a lot of times those were for F tubas, and most of us don't have those in our instrument inventory. So that substitution, if the kids can read the music, they can play the music. So tuba quartets are a fabulous avenue to kind of look at. One of my kids' favorite years that they had playing some low brass choir. We played a fantastic version, Self's version of Ave Maria, mixed meter 3/2 to 2/2, just gorgeous low sonority. and then Terry Hutchinson's Tuba Juba Duba, which is a very comical, more jazzy type piece. There's a Wabash Cannonball Run, which is the kind of the train type of sound and things. So tuba quartets can definitely be a great avenue to kind of start with. So all of those different choirs, minimum of 7 players, maximum of 24. As I say, maximum of 24, that has to do a lot with where you're going to perform. Solo and ensemble season, we're typically in classrooms. And so you have to communicate a little bit with your host site of where you're going to, where those performances might be. I typically do host solo and ensemble a lot of times. And for us, because I know that we're going to have lots of choirs and the choirs are going to be bigger sized, we typically use our auditorium for just choir entries. So that may mean that the percussion judge starts in the auditorium, listens to a few percussion choirs, then they move to the band room to listen for the rest of the day. The brass judge may start in whatever classroom they're in, and then around 10 o'clock, when brass choirs sometimes are, that judge will then move after his break to the auditorium and then head back to the room. Similar idea, all those woodwind entries are typically right after lunch or in the early afternoon, and so the judge moves to that site. I've had some times where when we've gone some places where we've been in a classroom and we had to basically kick out all of the audience because there weren't any room once you added 24 kids and seats. And I'm pretty sure I almost was sitting on the judge's desk. I can tell you that wasn't a very successful year for us because our intonation wasn't very good in that hot room. Just a couple of more entries to chat with you, and then some basic benefits of that I definitely want to highlight. Percussion. I think percussion choirs are pretty typical for a lot of us. And just as there's 2 different percussion entries that you can do. There's a percussion choir as well as a keyboard mallet percussion. Now, the percussion choir is 5 parts to 16 players. And that has to do with like all the different instruments that you can do. Must employ only instruments found within a typical percussion section. This has to do with no clapping and no body percussion type things. The other entry is the keyboard mallet percussion. This is 5 to 16 players, must have a majority of keyboard percussion instruments, a majority of keyboard percussion instrument parts. Now, when I'm doing percussion entries and there are mallet parts, some of the tricks that I've used is if the battery instruments are drowning things out, I don't feel any issue with that, with making sure to double some of those mallet instruments at times. And it also depends on how many kids you're trying to get involved in different things. Always remember, like if you're thinking a mallet choir, how in the world would I do something like that? Your mallet depth is sometimes bigger than you think. Take those piano kids, teach them how to hold the sticks, and suddenly you've got some extra mallet players. I know I just judged at Solo Fest in a smaller school, and it was a really fun piece to watch. But as I watched some of those mallet players, I'm like, oh, that's a flute player, that's a clarinet player, I'm sure. But I was more excited that the kids were involved in getting a chance to do that. I have included in my handout a few scheduling considerations. At my school, recently we added a quest time, kind of a home room. It's about a half an hour time slot, and I have for me, it's very fortunate that it's right before my band class. Our school is block scheduling, AB days, and so that quest 30 minutes every day allows me a lot of opportunities for these choirs to meet, and then my hour and a half, 85 minutes every other day, I can divide into 10 to 15 minutes per instrument choir and work through those things. And you can look in the handout, it's just at a couple of examples of how I might schedule those things. As I said earlier, this is a focus for us after our February concert, and that in 3 weeks, with every other day schedule, we're going to get between 10 and 12 rehearsals, between the band class and a few extra sessions that we try to meet. And at 10 to 15 minutes each one of those practices, that's not a ton of time, but it's the right amount of time for our school. Another thing in the handout that you'll be able to look at is the past decade or so of repertoire that I've used. So you'll see several repeats. This year I found a couple of new pieces. Our percussion choir did a Standridge piece called Taiko. And so we were able to kind of focus on a Japanese inspired music. Last year, we did a piece called Kabe, which was African drumming inspired. The year before that was a piece called Oriental, which was more Korean inspired, based on that pentatonic scale. My mallet choir this year did a piece called the Metronome, which was a movement out of a Beethoven work, and called for five marimba, up to five marimbas. So after borrowing a few, and we were able to be able to do some really cool things. And you'll be able to look through a wide variety of things that we've been able to do, and it's and there are years that I've even included the rating, so you can see that this isn't all the best. There have been years where those individuals that just don't do the practice, but those kids that need band, they're involved, and they don't necessarily tank your performance, but they don't help it a lot of times. The Eine kleine knock music that my kids read that little example for you, the first time I played it with a group, the kids tanked, and they were in a small room, and the intonation went all over the place, and things just fell apart, and they got a 4. And then there was another year where the kids got a 1. It's a harder piece. It just depends on the group sometimes. Keyboard instruments, as I said, just that piece called the Metronome. There was a piece that we did called Aquarium from the Carnival of Animals. The woodwind choirs, a lot of that time, solo and ensemble is a perfect time to get out music that you can showcase the stuff of Mozart, the stuff of Haydn, and it works really well. The stuff from the classical time period, because a lot of that stuff, Jaime Waxman and a bunch of his buddies, they already did the work and wrote and transcribed and rearranged all those pieces for you. I also have in my handout for you a list of resources and just links. One of the best sources that I've found lately is a publishing company, Eighth Note Publishing, where you can go in and you can do search for the trumpet choir, and you can even pick how many numbers of kids. Flute choir, how many numbers of kids, and the ripples in the sand that the flute choir played for you. The first time I bought that piece, I bought it for a trumpet choir, and it was a blast, and the kids had a great time. And then I started looking and thinking about what that would sound like, for a flute group. And so definitely I spent several of those pieces you could buy it for many different types of instrumentations. And the last thing that I want to leave you with is just the basic reasons of why these benefits. We've talked about throughout this session about some of the opportunities for kids through this, whether it's a clarinet player picking up a contrabass for the first time, or for your kids to get a chance to play some piccolo or learn the alto flute, and maybe you're fortunate enough to have a couple of those. Young kids, young players, typically end up at the lower sections. Your third clarinets are sometimes 4 or 5 kids. Without some of the music like this and a push, they may stay in those sections for a long time because they might not believe in themselves. Part of the reason that I hold choirs to a stronger level is that idea that kids get nervous playing by themselves. Most middle school programs, we tell the kids that you're going to play a solo. It's a requirement, and they play for solo judges. Typically, we don't have most of the time when I'm judging, I'm not listening to a piano accompaniment for middle schools. The kids just come in and play. When we get to high school, we have to add that element, and so that's a big learning curve. And sometimes that's a thing that puts kids off of high school band. They just want to be done with that. The choir entry, having 2 or 3 of your friends in your section playing along with you, that safety in numbers is a huge benefit. A lot of us play along with our students in our lessons, and definitely need to listen to them on their own individually. But I think most of you would agree that when does the kid play a little bit more confident? A lot of times is when there's somebody playing along with them. Sometimes it's they feel better about rhythm, and sometimes it's they feel better about how they sound. Sometimes some of the benefits of these choir entries is facing an area where you're going to have to replace a kid. That bass clarinet is a senior and is going to be leaving. I need to double that part, and I need to figure out who's going to be able to take up that spot next year, because the incoming group doesn't have a bass clarinet. So this is a great opportunity for that. Percussionists. I require my percussionists to take solos just so that I can make sure that they're learning as many instruments as possible, and they are percussionists, not drummers. Tuba players. How many times in a march are the tuba players playing just the oomp, and the French horns playing the paw? These choir entries are a great opportunity for those kids to get beyond that. Tuba's playing the melody the entire time. What a concept. So where do you start? I've given you a list of music that you can think about, collections that you probably even have in your library. Start small. Start with a woodwind choir, a brass choir, a percussion choir. Expand from there. Look at where your biggest sections are. You have a ton of clarinets, clarinet choir. Don't feel like the pressure is that these have to be necessarily the select groups. These can be the entire section. Some of you with bigger programs, if you expand to multiple of your bands, if you're a program, some of your bigger schools that have multiple bands, this is a great chance to build some camaraderie across those band programs. Now, scheduling can be a nightmare. We do have a program. Our second semester is 9th grade band one day and 10th, 12th the other day. And so trying to put their rehearsals together that's where I'm using that quest time a lot. Otherwise, it's stealing them out of the same class, and you know how that works really well with your other teachers. So those are some definitely benefits. One of the big things that I think the kids start to learn is through solo and ensemble, you can teach about the ballot. This is a great excuse to kind of go through that ballot with your students, make them listen to other groups, see where things are. They can start to listen to just how that clarinet group sounds. How much of our repertoire, our concert band stuff, has a woodwind choir section that passes to a brass choir section, or features this or some kind of different instrumentation. And by doing that, being specific on a whole song, kids' ears are really going to develop. I welcome you sending me an email, asking me questions. This is by no means a perfect system, but it's a system that's worked for me for about 23 years now. And I really think it is valuable, and it's an important part of what our program does. And I hope that you can take some of my ideas and make them tricks and trades for yourself. So thank you to Mary Crandall for allowing me to be here and do this online. This was the only way for me to be able to do that this year during my session assigned time. This year I'll be with my wife who's having surgery this Friday. So if you can keep us in your prayers at that would be great. So let me know if you have any questions, and thank you for your attendance.